Good morning, everyone. I'm going to call the meeting to order. We do not have a quorum yet, but we do have a lot of testifiers on the agenda today. As we announced last week, we're starting the process of the budget resolution. There will be no vote or any amendment or bill introduction or resolution introduction on the budget resolution today, other than just what you have in the packet that is blank. But we are, after we are through taking testimony from Commissioner France and Budget Director Kelly, going to be taking testimony on what people think the total number and the various target numbers in the budget resolution should be. And so that'll be the agenda for today. I don't yet know exactly when we'll be voting on the budget resolution. We have to, as a lot of people probably know, vote on it no later than a week from tomorrow, and there's a good chance that that will probably be the day that we do it. But we'll let you know as we know more on that today. There will be no voting, just testimony. Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask you what your intent is on the rule dealing with the total expenditures for the state budget that was re-referred from the Rules Committee to the House floor, as I understand it, and then back now to Ways and Means, and you've posted it as being in the possession of the committee. So what is your intent with the amendment to the rules that's now before Ways and Means?
Well, I guess I think that that's before Ways and Means. That's the, for people who may not be following, that's the, what is it, $39,338,000,000 roughly, $337,671,000 proposed target that Representative Winkler had brought forward on the floor that we referred to the Ways and Means Committee, and that's basically, you know, one of many numbers that will be considered when we posted the hearing for today. We certainly asked not only outside groups, but any members that wanted to bring forth a particular number to talk about to feel free to come and provide testimony. I mean, if someone wants to speak on behalf of that particular number, that's certainly in order. When we get to the point of having the budget resolution discussion, if that is not our number, well, even if it is our number, you know, that discussion certainly is in order. If it's not the number that we choose, if someone wants to make an amendment to say that that should be the number, you know, it's certainly in order to consider. But I guess I feel that that, along with all the other proposals, are what we're going to be talking about today and for the next week or so. Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, I think you've put two questions now on the table. What the number will be in the budget resolution is one question, and it could be that number. By the way, that's built on the November forecast. There would be a number that arguably dealing with February forecast, slightly different, but not in a major way. So the number that might be used in the budget resolution, but we now have, interestingly enough, and I don't recall in the past that a rule has ever been referred to Ways and Means. So the other question is, what is your intent with the rule? That's a different question. That's separate from the budget resolution. You may or may not choose to use the number there, but are we going to have a discussion of the rule and then refer it back to the Rules Committee? I mean, it would be rather unique if this committee did, in fact, in the end, adopt a rule. Raise an interesting jurisdictional question, I guess, between committees, but certainly we could have a discussion perhaps of the number that would be in the rule and then refer it back to the Rules Committee. But I'm just asking basically what our procedures are going to be, because I think you've identified two questions that are before the committee.
Well, Representative Carlson, I guess the whole House referred the rule in question here. I guess I think that it was meant as a item to be discussed as part of the budget resolution, that was the item that was the main topic. But I guess if people feel like we should, you know, actually
Just saying hi.
have a hearing and say that that should be part of our official rules. I guess, people can talk to me about it if they want to put that into the budget resolution as the number. I, expect we'll certainly be open to amendments and discussion on it. I guess I look at it as one of, many items that are before the committee, just as we have many testifiers today, some of which may be proposing their own numbers.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chairman, I was on rules for many years, and not currently, so maybe it'd be kind of interesting if we started to dabble with the rules and ways and means. But I was just wondering what your plans are, being that it's in your jurisdiction, and you posted it, which is appropriate. But I think we'll probably have more discussion, maybe even today, if somebody comes forward and testifies about the rule.
Well, I guess I'd just say, Representative Carlson, I think that my plans mainly relate to saying that we should be talking about that number and considering it, along with a lot of other numbers. In regard to the rules side, I was only on the Rules Committee for one term, and then I decided, well, maybe there are other committees that I'd rather be on. But I guess if people feel like we need to discuss the rules side of it, I'm certainly open to discussing that, too.
Mr. Chairman, maybe you want to talk to the Majority Leader about that question, but that's an internal one. Thank you.
Well, she voted to send it here, but anyway. All right, well, we can talk about that more. With that, do we have a quorum? Not quite. Okay. All right. We don't have a quorum, but in the interest of being expeditious with our time, I want to welcome Commissioner France and Budget Director Kelly back to the committee. Commissioner France, I know we've got some questions for you, but I know we kind of ran out of time when we were here a couple of weeks ago. Do you have any other things you want to say about the budget forecast or anything else? And I guess maybe you can confirm, I've heard the supplemental budget is coming out tomorrow. Is that in fact the case?
Mr. Chair, members, well, thank you for asking us back again today. There's really nothing to add on the budget forecast. From my point of view, we're anticipating releasing the supplemental budget for the governor tomorrow, which the governor will announce. And so I'm happy to talk more about the budget reserve level at this time if you'd like, or we can talk about some other matters, whatever is on your mind.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I'd like to talk about the budget reserve level and the cash flow account. Those are also items that we need to set as part of the budget resolution. And as I talked to you before, I think there are some items that need a little more discussion. So I guess maybe you could give us a few more of your views on that, and then I know I at least have some questions.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I think at this point what I'd like to do is just give some opening comments about the budget reserve report that you all have, and then Budget Director Kelly, after questions, can also talk a little bit about the cash reserve account in particular. But I am assuming that the members all have, the committee all have a copy of the January 2015 budget reserve report in front of you. Here's a copy of the first page on the screen. So let me just start there and talk about how that report was determined and how it was released, and you can have some questions about that. There's a letter from me transmitting that report to you in January of this year. As many of you know, the Budget Trends Study Committee back in 2008, of which, Mr. Chair, you remember obviously, and Representative Carlson remembers, there were a lot of great ideas and thoughts that came out of that report, and one of them was a concern about what's the correct level of reserve that we should have in this state. And so, as an outgrowth of that, we now have a statute that requires every January that the MMB provides a budget reserve report recommending what is the percentage or what should the target level be of the budget reserve. The budget reserve currently is made up of really two components. It's both the cash reserve account, which is statutorily designated as $350 million, and currently the statutory amount of the reserve account is $811 million, almost $811 million. Now that doesn't take into account the $183 million that we added last November based on the new automatic reserve provision. So by adding the cash reserve account, the cash account, I'm sorry, the reserve account, and the new additional money that we put into there, we have a reserve amount of $1.344 billion as of this particular moment. Now, the budget, the statute requires, as I mentioned, every January that we present this report to you, and it's based upon an analysis of the cash flow, the reserve amount, and it's also based on an analysis of the volatility of the revenue stream that we have in Minnesota. As you all know, any revenue stream has an inherent risk involved in it, and those risks really relate to the economy and how the revenues follow the economy, whether it's up or down. So the budget reserve percentage that's determined under subdivision 8 of statute 16A.152 provides that the annual review will make a recommendation as to the percentage of the current biennium general fund non-dedicated revenues. So that's where we start, is what is the level recommended of non-dedicated general fund revenues. And so if you go to the report itself, the budget reserve report, you can see that the budget reserve recommendations is on the first page there, and that is where the economists at MMB have analyzed the annual revenues that come into Minnesota, and they look at the volatility of the revenue stream. And in 2014-2015, in the current biennium, the recommended reserve policy, or the reserve level, is recommended to be 5.1% of the current biennium's general fund non-dedicated revenues. That's kind of a long phrase there, but essentially what that means is that for all those general fund revenues that are not specifically dedicated to some particular fund, we recommend as a target 5.1%. So if you look down at the bottom of that page, you can see the calculations that are made by MMB, and the percent of 5.1% of the non-dedicated general fund revenues in 2014-2015 would total $1,990 million as a reserve level or reserve target. Now, the statute also requires that there be a recommendation for the next biennium, and the economists at MMB have recommended that the percentage should go to 5.2% because of the volatility of the revenue stream. So you can look down at the bottom of that very page there, you see that the MMB recommendation for the next biennium, 2016-2017, would be $2,166 million, or 5.2% of the 2016-2017 non-dedicated revenues. Now, those are target levels, and it's not, the statute doesn't require that we meet that initially. It simply requires that the automatic provision that we have in law now for the November automatic inclusion of any reserve is automatic until we hit that recommended level. So once we hit the 5.2%, for example, in 2016-2017, then the November forecast amount would not go beyond that target number. Now, obviously, the legislature, you all can change those target amounts, or you can change the amount, but currently that is the amount that we're looking for. Just by way of one more sort of reference, the current budget reserve and cash account, the total $1.344 billion, is about 3.4% right now of the current biennium's non-dedicated revenue. So we're at 3.4%, and the report recommends that we get to 5.2% in the next biennium. One of the things that the rating agencies really do review, and that is, how does Minnesota manage its budget and its reserve policy? As you recall, several years ago, we were reduced from a AAA rating to a AA rating, but we have had some progress. In November of 2013, when we made the last payment for the school shift that we had borrowed money from the schools, when we made that last payment, Moody's issued a report talking about the positive nature of that particular payment. And we also came off of the negative watch in August of 2013. The national rating agencies, because of the commitment that we'd made to removing some of these accounting shifts, had assigned us a negative outlook prior to that, but they removed that in August of 2013. So we're making progress toward restoring the AAA credit rating of Minnesota. And one of the things the rating agencies do tend to look at for states are the level of reserves that they have in their reserve accounts. I think the only other thing I'd mention, Mr. Chair, before I turn it over for questions, is that one of the things that has been particularly looked at positively by the rating agencies is the automatic November addition to the reserves that we have in law. And that not only that it's there, but it's already operated in effect. So in November, when we added $183 million to the reserve account, that got noticed by rating agencies, and it's certainly a positive way for the rating agencies to see that we're working toward that goal of achieving a target of 5.2% of the non-dedicated revenues as the target level for our reserve account. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions about the reserve account, or if you'd like, we could have Budget Kelly talk about the cash reserve account.
All right, members, before we take questions, I think I'd like to officially convene the meeting since we do have a quorum. Members, we have the minutes of the last meeting before us, and the chair will move the minutes with the following correction. If you look at the bottom of the first page on the vote underneath the ayes, we've got a typo we need to take out. Representative Hornstein, he did not vote twice, even though I know he felt passionately about the issue.
Yes,
and we need to include Representative Wagenius. And so with that amendment, I will move the minutes. Any other corrections or additions? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails. The minutes are approved. And with that, back to Commissioner France.
Mr. Chair, I neglected to put up the last slide, and that is a history back to 1987 of the combination of the cash account and the reserve account. The bottom of the chart, the blue, is the cash account, the cash that we have at the state of Minnesota, and the top is the red, is the reserve portion. So you can see over time, you can obviously follow the economic downturns fairly easily by looking at this chart. But this chart shows the way that we've been able to move that total cash reserve and budget reserve to over $1.3 billion. Now, we have in there also the projected for this next biennium and for the biennium after that. But it's just and one of the things that we often you hear people refer to the rainy day fund, and in the vernacular of most budget analysis, the rainy day fund is the combination of our cash reserve and our budget reserve. And with that, I'll stand for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, questions for the Commissioner. Representative Lincheski.
I think Representative Carlson.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Well, Mr. Chair, and nice to see you, Commissioner. I actually just have a question for you, if that's appropriate.
Sure.
And just thinking about this a little bit, and Mr. Chair, I can't remember which years you were gone. I mean, you were here.
I left I did not run for election again in 2006.
Okay. So I didn't think you were here for most of this, but I think you were the chair of Ways and Means. And I remember Speaker Swigum used to serve on your committee. Is that correct?
Yes, I chaired Ways and Means from 2003 to 2006, and Speaker Swigum was on it for the first term.
Okay, so that's when it would have been. In the first term, as I remember, Speaker Swigum was on the committee back when you chaired Ways and Means. We had the big debate about counting inflation, and in fact, to this day, in the forecast, legislators see this line that says, if we counted inflation, this is what it would be. And that was my legislation that you accepted my amendment in Ways and Means. And so if we didn't have that line that tells us what inflation would be, we wouldn't know it. And we probably wouldn't talk about it. Now, it's still not in there, but at least we have a bookmark in the statute that's reported on all the forecasts, and that was an amendment I offered in Ways and Means. So I hope this year you'll accept some of my amendments as we go forward. But I did want to mention to you...
Well, Representative Lincheski, now that I don't have Speaker Swigum on the committee keeping an eye on me like he must have felt he had to do the first couple years, who knows what will happen?
Well, maybe Speaker Doubt will want to join us. I don't know. But, Mr. Chair, I just a little history as we think about the whole issue of the budget reserve. And I don't know how your caucus works, how you and Representative Davids work on this, but Representative Carlson and I always worked really closely together because, he was finance, Ways and Means, and I had to deal with, finding the money. And so, this really is a Ways and Means issue, but we have dealt with these combined in Ways and Means and taxes, these issues historically. So Representative Carlson and I carried legislation for Governor Pawlenty due to the cash flow issues that we were facing when we were in such extreme deficit. Governor Pawlenty asked us if we would help him reorder the accounts. That's how bad it got around here. We weren't going to be able to make payments, so we had to move around cash flow within all the accounts so that we wouldn't fall into huge trouble. And so Representative Carlson and I worked on that, and that became law, and I don't recall what year that was. But I was the chief author of the budget trend study, and you weren't here for that. So, people cite that all the time, and I just want to let you know on that. I chief authored that, and Senator Cohen, and that really, the whole point of the budget trend study was to look at both the spending and the revenue side. And that's what that study did, and tried to look for the future, what would be the future problems. And then in the last couple of years, in the tax committee, we passed a volatility study, so we could look at that as it relates to the reserve. And then most recently, I think it was last year, the year before, we went through a process with the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Pew Charitable Trust, who came to Minnesota and testified about the budget reserve. And as a result of that, we now have this new law. That's part of it, that we have this automatic filler that's going into the budget reserve and cash flow account. And this has, for me, been something we've spent 10 years talking about. And we're now in the best financial situation we've ever been in the history of the state in the reserve. And unless somebody changes the law, we're set to continue to improve that, possibly get our AAA back. And I would hope, and I'm sure that that's a goal for you, Mr. Chair, is that we could restore the state to a AAA. But as you are having this hearing, can you give us some insight if you're thinking, just you personally, that the budget reserve and the cash flow account, and then the reserve that's going to continue to fill to $2.1 billion, are you thinking that's too high? Are you thinking that we should start taking money back out of the reserve? I'm just kind of interested in hearing your philosophy about this. When Representative Carlson was working on it, there was a lot of testimony that states should be at 7% or 8%, and I remember even Governor Pawlenty said that our current number was too low. And so now we are at a higher percentage, as the commissioner just testified to, and we've made a lot of changes. We've done a lot of study, and we've had a lot of people around the nation get involved in this. And I'm glad we're talking about it, but can you give me some insight, the fact that you're the Ways and Means Chair and you're calendaring this, where are you thinking we're going on the cash flow and the budget reserve and then the new law? Are you feeling that this is too much, or are you going to gun for a AAA? Just curious as to what your goal is here.
Well, Representative Lenczewski, first of all, while I wasn't here for the Budget Trend Study Commission, I was here because I was on it. So I wasn't here when it passed, but I was on it, and I, sat through all that testimony. But I think, we're about to have all this testimony on the total budget targets for individual areas. That includes targets for individual areas such as the cash flow account and reserve account. And frankly, one of the reasons I wanted the commissioner back today is so that I could ask him some questions myself on those areas. And so I guess I think it's inappropriate for me to give you my feelings on what I think those numbers should be until I've heard some more testimony on it. Representative Lenczewski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'll ask you again then later down the road. I think I'm trying to highlight, as somebody who's mostly been here for bad times. We've mostly been in deficit, and I don't know that people always realize how hard it is to get out of deficit and how it takes years and years and years to get out of structural deficit, which we finally are, and to pay back all the shifts, whether it's the school shifts or deficits. There is one left, and I know, Mr. Chair, you're carrying it, and I am too, which is to pay back the June acceleration. But overwhelmingly, it takes a lot of work bipartisanly with multiple governors to correct structural deficits. And I just would caution people about, what we need to do, which is probably, in my estimation, not to go backward, but to get that AAA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Carlson.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, by the way, references to Speaker Svigum. He was also on the committee when Representative Bishop was chair, and I'm not sure who he was keeping an eye on, whether it had been you or Bishop. But
I'm glad I'm not alone.
But he also was on the Finance Committee, which we had a little different structure while you were gone, and he was the lead Republican on that, and I do know who he was keeping an eye on at that point. Probably Representative Carlson, yours truly.
Probably.
But at any rate, I did have a question of the Commissioner. Commissioner Franz, when we talk about the cash flow and the current law and dealing with the November forecast, any thought given to whether we should include the February forecast until we get to our ultimate goal, which I think you said is, what, 5.1 or 5.2% as the goal currently? And I don't know if you've had a chance to give any thought to that or not, but it might be interesting to get some feedback from you as we begin to discuss the budget resolution that'll be before us, I guess, next week at some point.
Commissioner Franz.
Mr. Chair, Representative, well, that's an interesting question, because I know that a lot of different items were considered, as Representative Winchesky mentioned, when this was heard last year and this new automatic provision was added. There were different versions, but I think the version that was adopted, where it's just the November forecast, provides some pretty good opportunity, because with the legislature in session when the February forecast comes out, I think one of the thoughts initially was, well, that's the opportunity for the legislature and the governor to make those decisions in real time while they're in session. So it provides the more flexibility for policymakers to decide if that automatic 1/3 balance is the right amount, or maybe should be more or should be less. So I think at this point, the thought we had was that with the legislature in session, especially in a budget year, it provides an opportunity for the legislature and the governor to weigh in on what that should be, the amount should be.
Representative Carlson.
Essentially, that was part of the discussion when we went with, as you point out, the November forecast. The budget situation, however, was a little different than it is currently, and with the size of it, it does perhaps put other alternatives on the table, at least for some discussion, but it's good to know where MMB is coming at it from then. Thank you.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, I have just a couple questions, but the first one really relates to under your summary and conclusion, and I'll draw your attention to about the middle through that paragraph where it says the recommended level given the underlying volatility of Minnesota's tax structure. And I'm just wondering if you could unpack that gift for us.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, where were you, Representative?
On the back page of your budget reserve report, in the last paragraph under summary and conclusion. I'm just wondering if you could expand on what is meant by given the underlying volatility of Minnesota's tax structure.
Mr. Chair, Representative, a little emphasis there, dramatic drum roll, if you will. The opportunity, I think, here is one of the things that I think was really instructive coming out of the Budget Trend Study Commission was this analysis of the volatility of a revenue stream. And as we all know, all revenue streams have risk and have different levels of volatility. So what this is referring to is the economists in our shop have taken a look at the amount of volatility. As we know, the corporate income tax is considered to be the most volatile of all of the different revenue streams, because corporate incomes can vary so much dramatically from year to year, especially when economic downturns occur. So what they try to look at is all the different revenue streams, the corporate income tax, the individual income tax, the sales tax, to take a look at how do those revenue streams react to economic changes or economic downturns. And so they, in looking at the current revenue stream, believe that the volatility had increased somewhat over the last year or so. And I think part of that was a recognition that we're seeing more and more capital gains as part of the individual income tax. And that's, as we know, capital gains can vary quite dramatically from year to year. But also more income is being paid in the form of compensation or bonuses, which are also tied to economic conditions. So you have a situation where corporate income taxes continue to be somewhat volatile, and individual income taxes have become slightly more volatile. So that was why there was an adjustment to increase the percentage from 5.1% to 5.2% for the next biennium.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, and I'm looking at the reports that are included in the summary here, and a couple of them, when we take a look at the month-to-month cash flow of the state, there appears to be a couple of months where we're showing some negative numbers. I'm wondering how we explain that to constituents when we're running deficits on a month-to-month basis. Where is that money coming from that we cover our bills with?
Commissioner France.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I guess I'll leave that to Budget Director Kelly. The cash flow is a very dynamic account, as you can imagine. And so based on the way we receive revenues throughout the year and when we make some of these payments, you're now seeing a chart in front of you that talks about the per month difference in revenues and spending, and I'll let Budget Director Kelly describe this.
Director Kelly.
Members of the committee, thank you. I'm here to speak a little bit about cash flow, answer any questions. But in a nutshell, we adopt a balanced budget every year, but our revenues come into the state's bank account at a different rate than our payments go out of the state's bank account. And so we make about half of our expenditures in the beginning of the year, but only less than that. Most of our expenditures revenues come in the second half of the year. And so it's the timing of when our revenues come in versus when our payments go out that create cash flow problems. So this chart here shows you that on a month-to-month basis, the comparison of our revenues and our payments out. So the blue line is our payments and the red line is our revenues. And so some months we have more cash than we have on hand than other months. And this next chart here kind of...
Excuse me, did you say, Director Kelly,
One more.
you said did you say the blue line are the revenues and the red is the spending?
That's right. Did I misspeak? I apologize.
Yeah.
The blue line is the revenues and the red
I'm
is
sorry.
the spending.
Commissioner France, did you have something to that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, before you move on, Budget Director Kelly, to Representative Linchewski's point, if you look at June is there are a lot of dollars coming in June, and that is partly a result of the June Accelerated, where we've asked businesses to accelerate their payments from July into June so we can count those in that particular biennium. So that is just a good example of where the revenue stream doesn't match the normal course of business. So I'll let that go on.
Sure, and in July and August, we have a lot of payments going out the door for healthcare providers and for our schools, and so our payments go out more quickly in the beginning of the year. Our revenues come in at the end of the year. And so this next graph simply shows that gap between revenues in and spending out on a monthly basis. That in July and August, we are typically cash poor, and again in February and March, but the rest of the months we typically have positive cash balances.
Okay.
If we look at this chart here, kind of hard to see up on the screen, but it's fiscal year 15's projection of cash balances on a month-to-month basis. And you can see here, this is just the general fund. You can see here that our cash flow changes on a daily basis, and so each month there may be a wide variance between our high point of cash and our low point of cash, and this just shows you how it changes from year to year. And so this is one area where in September, and again in April, we're projecting for fiscal year 15 that we would not have sufficient cash in the general fund to pay all of our bills in that particular month that we need to pay. And so what we do in that case is then we look to what we refer to as the statutory general fund. There are over 100 funds within state government. The general fund is the largest, and the other funds have more predictable and more regular revenue and expenditures within those funds. But the general fund, since it's the biggest and it has the biggest discrepancies between revenues in and spending out, we have the most cash flow challenges within that fund. So the statute allows us to borrow funds from other funds within the state, and we call it the statutory general fund. We cannot borrow from pensions, we can't borrow from bond proceeds, we can't borrow from trust accounts or endowments or other dedicated funds. But there are funds like the Miscellaneous Special Revenue Fund, the Healthcare Access Fund, federal funds. There are a variety. There's 70 funds from which we can borrow, and we move money from those funds into the general fund as needed, and when the general fund has a positive balance, we pay those funds back to the other funds. And we're always looking at those other funds to ensure that they can meet their payments and obligations with the resources they have, and if they can't because of our borrowing, we again move money around. So we're looking at cash on a daily basis. This next chart, again, it's hard to see up on the screen. The fiscal year 15 SGF stands for Statutory General Fund, cash balances. You can see the pattern looks similar, but what's different is the scale. So on the general fund, we were looking at having negative cash balances in a few of the months, but our lowest point on our statutory general fund is about $2.449 billion. So we have, within those 70 funds, we have sufficient cash. We're projecting that we will have sufficient cash each month to cover well in excess of all of our obligations that we need to pay out. And so that's how we manage the deficits that you see on some of those slides are within the general fund itself. But within our statutory funds, we have sufficient cash available.
Did you have another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, so in the event that either the cash flow account, because I would understand that's where the ebb and flow on a monthly basis is utilized, if we raise that, does that, maybe rhetorical, does that rectify the shortages that you then would have to seek out statutorily money to balance the checkbook of the state on a monthly basis?
Budget Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's a good question. I think we'd have to do a little more analysis about the extent to which the $350 million is insufficient. Going back to that very first slide we saw, to some extent, we have $1.3 billion cash flow. That the budget reserve sits within the general fund, and it sits there as a cushion against against needs. And because it's just sitting there as cash, it also acts as cash flow. And so that's why, as Commissioner Franz said, many people consider the combination of a cash flow account and a budget reserve account being rainy day funds. People also see that's the combination being your cash flow cushion. It's kind of like if you have a personal checking account and you always leave a little money on the bottom line that you subtracted to cover your clearing your checks. And if you also have money set aside in that account for a vacation fund, that also helps serve as cash flow as well. So the combination of these two things have made a difference. When we have had cash flow problems back in 2010, 2011, 2012, back in 2011 we actually took out a line of credit. The state took out a line of credit because we knew, we were projecting that all of our cash on hand between the general fund, the reserves, the cash flow account, the statutory funds. At that time, we had other borrowing tools at our disposal, administrative tools in terms of withholding payments from school districts. Between all of those tools, we were concerned that we would not have sufficient cash. And that was at a point in time where our cash flow account had been depleted below $350 million, and we did not have any budget reserves. In 2012, as our cash flow account got replenished, as our budget reserves got replenished, our cash position looked significantly improved. And so another picture in here. This is the last piece of paper in your packet that just compares our statutory general fund in fiscal years 13, 14, and projected for 15 and 16. And in 13, it probably would have been helpful to show 11, 11 and 12 on here as well, because the low points were below zero in the statutory general fund, where now we're seeing the statutory general fund low point to be at $2.461 billion in fiscal year 16. And so There's a combination of resources that we have to draw upon within the general fund alone. We're still looking at not having low points, even in fiscal years 15 and 16. But we have plenty of resources with all of our funds at our discretion to move around.
All right, thank you. I've got a number of people on my list here. I think, Representative Hornstein, did you have your hand up earlier?
Yeah.
All right.
It's short.
Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know if this would be for Commissioner Franz or Budget Director Kelly, but to this point about how and when we spend the reserve, is there criteria that have been set up? I imagine a bill comes in, it has to be paid, you pay it, but is there a kind of like a hierarchy as to what gets prioritization when we have to dip into the reserve? Is there criteria that you have for when you pay these things, or how who gets priority?
Director Kelly?
Sure. Mr. Chair and members, there is law that says here's what needs to happen if our forecast suggests we don't have a positive balance, our budget is no longer balanced and we're projecting a deficit. We can use the reserve. First we would use the reserve, and then the governor can resort to unallotment. And so, going back to this, we didn't have a budget reserve when Governor Pawlenty unallotted. So he was able to go directly to unallotment. But the first strategy in terms of a budget reserve in terms of a deficit, projected deficit, is to access the reserves. And there is language in law in terms of how the governor needs to notify the legislature, I believe.
Representative Hornstein.
But thank you. Just so quick follow-up. But if you have, let's say, you referred to examples around education and health care and June, things that you pay off. But, if there's, competing bills that have to be paid, how do you decide, what gets priority or what you pay and when?
Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair and Representative, when we access the cash in the budget reserve for cash flow purposes, we're not using the budget reserve in the sense of using the reserve to balance the budget. We're simply accessing the cash that's sitting in the general fund to meet our obligations for payments. And so law says we need to pay every bill within 30 days. And so when a bill comes in within 30 days, we need to pay that bill. We simply manage those payments as they come in. We look at cash across all the funds, and to the extent that there isn't the cash in the general fund to make those payments, we start looking at where the cash exists outside the general fund and where the positive balances are, and look at their projected payment schedule, and then we can make decisions about where to move cash. And when the general fund is positive again, we pay those funds back. So we have a balanced budget. The reserve is unspent, but the cash is sitting in the general fund, and we can use that cash to pay our bills, and it always gets paid back, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. Representative Kahn, did you have a question earlier?
No, I
Oh, okay, sorry. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is somewhat along the lines of what Representative Hornstein was asking. When, in times where we have spent down the budget reserve completely to zero, what was the thought process? Are we setting up for the future that the budget reserve would be paying for things like just existing programs, keeping them at their existing level, or is this to pay for increases in existing programs, or is this for new programs? What is the thought process of the administration for the budget reserve if we come into times of trouble, of how that money would be used outside of the initial items that are mandated to be taken care of?
Director Kelly or Commissioner? Who wants that?
You want to start?
Mr. Chair, I would simply say that the budget reserve is insurance against a potential deficit. And to the extent that there is a deficit in the current fiscal year, like if we were right now, if our February forecast had shown that we had a deficit, it would be up to the governor to decide to go to the reserves to resolve that deficit, or to come to the legislature and propose spending or revenue changes to address that deficit. And so what the governor would do in that case, I can't speak to that.
Representative, Commissioner, sorry.
No, that's right, Mr. Chair. Representative, I think the key is that the statute requires the commissioner to look at those shortfalls. If there is a shortfall, to look at those shortfalls and make sure that there is a reduction in spending to meet the anticipated revenues. And so that would be a process where we'd have to simply weigh all the requirements under law to pay. So it would require M&B to assess all of the obligations and make recommendations at that time.
Representative Anderson?
Mr. Chair, I'd be interested, Mr. Marks, if you don't have it today, but later on, historically, what has the legislature spending been out of the budget reserve, and has it been for maintaining, has it been for expanding, or has it been for new programs, or all of the above?
Mr. Marks, can you get some of that? Look it up, yes. All right, thank you. Representative Driscowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Director Kelly, the 70 different special funds that are used for the statutory general fund, I think is the terminology. What percentage of all special fund or all of all funds do those represent? About, and then that'd be the question.
Mr.
Director
Chair,
Kelly.
Representative, there are about 100 funds, give or take a few, and so that's about 70% of the funds. In terms of what value of the dollar, I have to get back to you on that. The general fund is the largest of all the funds. So.
Representative Driscowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Director Kelly. Do we know, and I missed the first few minutes of the hearing, but do we know the budget reserve and cash flow amount that we have now of almost $1.4 billion? Is that, has there been any time in our history where we have exceeded that? Is that an all-time high?
Director Kelly or Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that is an all-time high as far as we can tell from our records.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
What do you know? Representative Agenius.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Since we're looking at volatility of the revenue, what if you guys see, say, in May when we're still in session, or in September when we're not in session, you see significantly more volatility than was projected in this report? What's your procedure then?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, well, one of the things that we do rely on is the November and the February forecast. So one of the things that would obviously happen is, as we're working toward the February forecast, we would take those into account in making that projection. But in terms of the immediate, what do we start doing? I mean, I think clearly sound fiscal practice would necessitate that we get together and we talk about concerns and whether those concerns we think will be realized immediately and to what extent they might be immediate. So there, from a practical standpoint, we would have to wait really by law until the February forecast provides that change and the legal change in what revenues are available to us. But clearly we would begin planning and talking about it immediately, but I don't know exactly how at this point.
Representative Agenius.
Well, since this is based on volatility, and we could see substantially more volatility before we're back in session again, it does seem to me that there needs to be a process for you to communicate with not just few members of the legislature, but the legislature in general. That could be significant.
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, well, we do provide the monthly revenue reports. They give us some indication, but as we mentioned, those monthly revenue reports are difficult to take much from because they do vary a lot from month to month. But we do also do quarterly reports where we take a look at the last quarter in terms of revenue estimates. So those would be sort of the early warning signs I think you're discussing, and so we do provide that on the 10th of every month, which would give everyone an opportunity to look at sort of what's happening with our revenue stream.
Well, Commissioner, I've got a couple questions if I don't see anyone else here. If you could go to the slide that looks like this. It says general fund estimated cash balance. Yeah, that's it. So I guess I'm curious, where do I see the $350 million cash flow account or the $944 million budget reserve? I mean, why, in a sense, I'm kind of curious, well, why do we even have those numbers? Because I look on here and I see that, well, we're sort of hoping that if we could, we'd get up to a $2 billion total balance. And, I look at the projection and we're going to be at a $2 billion total balance at the end of FY15. But then, if I look a few months earlier, we have no balance at all. So I guess I'm wondering, I don't know if you can give me a sense of, is there a point in time at which there was originally an expectation that we'd have $350 million on the account? Was that sort of the idea that at fiscal year end, that's where those numbers would be? Or where do those numbers come from, other than just what we put into the budget resolution once upon a time?
Mr. Chair, well, you raised an excellent question. I mean, obviously, we look at the end of the fiscal year to figure out what's there, so to speak, in terms of the reserve and the cash account. And so with the cash account, though, it is one of those dynamic accounts that continues to move. And even though, as you see from this chart, the revenues come in differently than our actual expenditures, we do know that the money is sort of always there. We're projecting it'll be there at the end of the fiscal year because of our projected expenditures and revenues. So it's a dynamic account that varies literally daily. And so even though we project the end of the year a $350 million cash account, and now we have $1.3 billion in the total reserve, it's always there and available legally to draw upon, even though it may be changing from day to day. So it's a sort of one of those difficult to explain concepts where money moves in and out of the checking account for the state, but the actual authorized money for the cash account and the reserve is always there.
Well, Commissioner, one of the other things that strikes me is we've had that number, $350 million, as the cash flow account number for at least a decade, and yet our budget is at least 50% larger than it was a decade ago. I mean, would it make sense to, even if we didn't change the total number between the budget reserve and the cash flow account, would it make sense for the cash flow account to be increased and the budget reserve size to be decreased, even if we left the total number the same?
Mr. Chair, members, well, certainly one of the things, by expanding the cash account itself, we would eliminate the need to go to the statutory reserve fund. So by enlarging the cash account itself, even though it's just part of the overall reserve amount, we would provide more flexibility and reduce that borrowing that occurs from time to time. So it would make things more simple in that regard.
Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair, I would just add that the analysis that was done by the economists is specific to the budget reserve. So the volatility of revenues and the size of the budget reserve is based on the volatility of revenues as opposed to the need for cash assistance within the fund. So keeping the total amount the same, yet changing the distribution between the two would, in effect, negate some of the work we've done towards building adequate budget reserves to address our revenue volatility. Having them both, having a high level between the two of them helps address cash flow needs. And like Commissioner Franz said, the budget reserve and the cash flow account, together $1.4 billion, are our budget. And what you're seeing on this page is our checking account. And so we have a balanced budget, but our revenues come in at a different time than our payments go out. I had a job where I got paid the last day of the month for the whole month. And so I had to figure out how to pay my rent and everything without having a paycheck in the bank my very first month on the job. That's what this cash flow is about. I had a budget that was balanced, but I didn't have money to make any of my payments. So we make our K-12 payments, we make health care provider payments in June and in July and August when we get our revenues at the end of the month, at the end of the fiscal year.
If we doubled the size of the cash flow account to $700 million, but then deducted $350 million from the budget reserve, leaving aside the question of, whether it should be bigger in total, I mean, what effect would that have? Would that make any sense? Or it almost sounds like they're being used interchangeably now.
Mr. Chair, I think that's a really good question that we could talk more about is, do you need a separate cash flow account from a budget reserve account? I think that's a good question. What's important is that we have sufficient reserves to manage the volatility in our revenue, and that we have sufficient cash to make good on our bills. And do you need separate accounts, or can you have just one account? I think that's a reasonable question.
Okay. I see I've got a couple of other members that have got questions here. Just one more question I have on a little bit of a different subject. I know that we've got the budget reserve and to some extent the cash flow account if things turn bad. How do we have those invested right now? Are they invested at all? Or do they just all serve as sort of, there isn't any, there's no account anywhere that says, the state doesn't have a savings account that says budget reserve account with $994 million in it, or, $944 million in it. A commissioner.
Mr. Chair, you're correct. We don't have an account with $994 million in it. What we work with the State Board of Investment to make sure we have cash available to pay our bills as we project the timing of those payments, and to invest what dollars we may have on hand that we may not need more long term. So our pension accounts are invested differently than our cash flow account, or cash flow resources are invested. Invested treasurer's cash, pretty much this whole statutory general fund is managed by SBI as invested treasurer's cash. I think it gets in the neighborhood of 0 to 3% interest given depending on the month and the year. However, some of our trust funds are managed on a more long-term basis. If you recall, in the November forecast, we had a big payment that we needed to make to repay the closed landfill fund, and that fund was invested for the long term. It was invested in stocks by SBI, and so it was a significant payment that we needed to make for lost interest earnings there. So there's a big difference between the long-term investments and the cash we have on hand, which is invested on a very short-term basis by FBI.
I guess I do have one last question. Commissioner or Budget Director Kelly, if you turn to the next page and you see the statutory general fund cash balance, the lowest it's gone in the last year is $2,332 million. So what of the recommendation that we have about a $2 billion budget reserve? I mean, what would you say to someone that said, well, we already have a $2 billion budget reserve. We've got an extra $2.3 billion right here.
Mr. Chair, what this chart shows in terms of all the statutory general fund cash balance, it shows the cash available, but those we have to borrow from for limited times and pay back. Those are not generally accessible for us to pay appropriations from. So we simply use these to manage, as Director Kelly mentioned, we use these to manage our checking account, so to speak, but they're not there for us to access for appropriated programs from the legislature on an ongoing basis. They simply show we have a lot of cash available if we need to write a big check, but they don't show that we've got that cash available for either a reserve amount or to pay annual appropriated amounts.
Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chair, I'll pass looking at the clock because I know there's others.
Yep, no, we do have some other testifiers here. I'm not sure we're going to get through everyone, but Representative Albright.
Commissioner, just a quick question when we talk about the rating agencies, both Moody's and S&P. Given the current rating that both of those provide to the state, if we were to increase our budget reserve, could you correlate, if we got back the highest rating by both agencies, could you correlate that possibly to what the reduction in the interest paid on our outstanding notes would be.
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, I can't answer that precise question. Maybe Budget Director Kelly can. I will answer the general premise of that, and it is, as you know, extremely hard to project or predict that when that might occur, but maybe Director Kelly can answer the difference in the interest rate.
Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair, Representative, it wouldn't change the interest rate on our outstanding debt because
Understand.
we've...
But for new issues.
Right, for new issues. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I could answer it. It's been asked before. There is we could do some general analysis to say that AAA states typically get an interest rate of X and AA plus states typically get an interest rate of Y and what the difference would be. Minnesota is a little unique in that people appreciate our bonds, whether they're AAA or AA plus. And so while most AA plus states may be getting a lower interest rate, our interest rate may be a little bit better than the AA plus pack because people tend to like Minnesota bonds.
All right. Any other questions from any members that I've missed here? Well, with that, we ended up taking a little more time on this than I had expected, but Commissioner, Budget Director, thank you very much for coming. This is an interesting topic, and we do need to set a cash flow and a budget reserve target as part of our budget resolution process, and so we'll be thinking about this some more. With that, as we move on to the testifiers, we have around a dozen people that want to testify. I'm going to call Nikki Villavicencio first because I know that she has an earlier commitment she needs to leave for. Then next up I'm going to call Peter Nelson. And members, we do have the next meeting in this room is at 12:45. I have a commitment at noon, but I'm thinking we could maybe go on past that, and I can have Vice Chair Albright continue to chair the committee if we run out of time here, and I can then listen to the testimony on tape as anyone else can. Just trying to accommodate people and also trying to avoid coming back for an evening session, especially with all the other budget deadlines that we have. But that's just kind of basically what I'm thinking of as a plan for now. So if we can keep everyone's testimony to no more than 5 minutes, so we can try to accommodate everyone in the next hour, 10 minutes. And sorry if I don't completely pronounce your name right, ma'am, but Ms. Villavicencio, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Nikki Villavicencio, and I'm here today as a supporter of the SEIU Home Care Workers Union and also the Minnesota Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities to share with you why I feel it is so important that we make real investments in funding for programs that support families like mine. I live in Maplewood with my partner and our 2-year-old daughter, Allie. Like thousands of seniors and people with disabilities, in order to live independent lives, we rely on funding from programs that are in this budget. We are incredibly active in countless organizations in our community, from the SEIU Home Care Union to the Met Council and the Maplewood City Parks Commission to activities at our church. When we value the Minnesotans that participate in these programs, we restore dignity for thousands who only want to choose where they live. I am here to remind you all of the people like me directly impacted by your decisions and the workers who support my quality of life. My family and many others prefer to live in our own home, and you have the power to fund the long-term care programs that make this possible. These programs also save the state money, so it's a win-win. It is also important to provide the funding needed for nursing home workers who are commonly understaffed and overworked. Seniors who need nursing home care need to be treated with dignity as well. As you are working out funding levels, I hope you remember those of us who are directly impacted by your choices and take full advantage of the opportunity to truly fund these programs so seniors and people with disabilities all across the state are able to live the lives they choose. Thank you, Chair and members.
Thank you, Ms. Villavicencio. All right. Next I'm going to call up Mr. Nelson. And then I understand that Representative Winkler's in the audience, and I'll call up Representative Winkler, who wanted to provide some testimony. Mr. Nelson, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Good morning. Again, my name is Peter Nelson, and I am the Director of Public Policy for Center of the American Experiment. And in your packets, you should have some PowerPoint slides that I've provided for you. So just if you would take a look at those. To give you some background, I've been looking at the budget for probably at least back till 2007. In 2007, I wrote a report on how our aging will actually impact our budget in the next decade, 2 decades. And the number that really stuck out to me when I read that report was the fact that the census estimated that in 2000 we had about 5 workers per retiree. In 2030, we're going to have 3 workers per retiree. And that just always stuck out to me as the indication that we have an ongoing pressure on our budget moving forward as people age. And so we always have to pay very close attention to what we're spending our money on. And fortunately, a year later after I did that, we had the budget trend study. People actually read that study and paid attention to it and acted on it. So we've had some good things happen over the years because of that study. But moving on to the slides that I have here, the first slide I have for you shows the increase in spending that we've experienced from 1960 to the current budget. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that this current budget represents a substantial increase in spending over the prior budget and all other budgets. It represents $1,181 increase per person. That's inflation adjusted, and this increases the pressure on our budget. This increases the pressure on our long-term ability to meet those needs with the revenues that we have coming in. So that's slide number 1. And I do want to just mention the fact that we have a number of other pressures that are on our budget. We have pressures from globalization that are happening. We have pressures from rising healthcare costs. And so there's all sorts of reasons why we need to pay close attention to this. So move on to slide number 2. Slide number 2 addresses the fact that so much of this increase in spending happened in 2015. Between 2014 and 2015, spending went up by $1.4 billion in the general fund budget. That is a substantial amount of money, and the reason why I want to point this out to you is because if you move now on to slide number 3 here, I have developed a table that shows you what spending could be in the future biennium if we adjust for various spending expenditure limitations. So there's all sorts of expenditure limitations across the country. We're one of the states that doesn't have a limitation. 25 states do have a limitation of some sort. And if we had a limitation that was, say, based on growth in personal income over the past 5 years, or growth in personal income over the past 10 years, or growth in inflation, projected inflation, and population growth, this table shows you what we should be spending if we adjusted for that. And I do want to point out the reason why I had the last slide is because it depends on what level you start at. What's your base? And I think it's reasonable to look at the 2014 base of spending because that takes away that huge spending increase that we experienced in 2015. It helps give us some perspective, I think, about where we should be. So you can see here on this table that there's a range of spending targets depending on which spending limitation you would use and depending on whether you use 2014 as the base and 2015 as the base. And that ranges from anywhere down to $38.8 billion all the way up to $42.1 billion, which is pretty close to what the governor's recommended. So and I think right now, as we're looking to the future and after experiencing this incredible increase over the past budget cycle, it's most reasonable to identify an adjustment based on population and inflation. That's, as we want to move into, I think we want to move into a period where we're not increasing spending like we increased spending over the past budget cycle. And that gives us the lower budget targets. And So using that, I've just identified what I think is a reasonable budget target, which I believe is about $40.2 billion. That's in your packets. So the $40.2 budget target that I've identified is basically linked to the $39.6 billion. If we were spending at 2014 levels and adjusted based on personal income through those 2 years, we would be spending $39.6 billion. Now, I've adjusted that upwards a little bit to $40.2 billion because I agree with Budget Trends Commission study and I agree with MMB that we need to be funding the reserve account to higher levels. And this, and for a couple different reasons, we all experienced the shocks that happened over the last budget crisis. We had the budget crisis back in 2001. We really need that reserve account to smooth out those bumps, those serious bumps that we probably can expect to see in the future. And it relieves pressure to raise taxes. It relieves pressure to lower spending to dramatic degrees. And so I absolutely support that $2 billion, basically, budget reserve account that MMB proposes. And to do that, you can allocate $600 million out of the budget right now, and that brings us up to that $40.2 billion budget target. I also want to conclude by identifying just a couple different items in the budget in terms of targets. I agree that we have some transportation funding shortfalls, and I believe that we should increase our transportation budget through the general fund by about $400 million. That doesn't get us to that $5 billion that we're $5 or $6 billion that we're told that we're short right now, but it gets us quite a bit of the way there. And the one great thing it does is it forces us to prioritize transportation funding in with all of the other funding sources that we have. And finally, I will just, in my work on looking at the budget, it's very clear that the state of Minnesota spends way more per person served on our Medicaid population and on other health and human services populations. And we spent the fourth most on Medicaid per person in 2010, the most recent year that we have data for. And we also identified spend the second most on public welfare when you look at public welfare spending for people below 200% of the federal poverty guideline. We are an outlier there, and as long as we continue to be an outlier there, it's going to be harder to fund those necessary services for the people who truly need them. And so I'll leave you there and conclude.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nelson. I hesitate to take questions from members because I do want to give everyone a chance to testify, but I do have Representative Wagenius, Carlson, and Liebling. Do you guys want to ask questions? Representative Wagenius?
It'll be quick. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with you that in this time of surplus, we should be filling up the reserve, but you're not recommending filling it up to the point that the management and budget want. So why not fund the reserve to the level, since we are in a time of surplus, recommended?
Well,
Nelson.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, Representative Wagenius. It is pretty close. $600 million on top of $1.35 million gets you to about the $2 billion mark. It's just a rough number. I would be happy to support filling it all the way up to what they've recommended.
Thank you.
Representative Carlson.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I'll even pose it as a question. I just want to comment, though, when the testifier talks about the spending increases and uses terminology such as huge, it really should be footnoted with we paid back the schools. We paid a huge debt, and that, I think, should at least be footnoted, or at least I'll make the footnote to those comments that when we talk about that spending increase, there were a number of things about that budget where we were attempting to get us off the roller coaster that we had been on, and we just had testifying by MMB about the need to shift dollars around to pay our bills, and one of those was the school district shift, and we paid that back. So when we start playing with these percentages, I think we have to keep that in mind.
Mr. Nelson, did you want to make a comment to that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Representative, I did account for that in the spending difference between 2014 and 2015. In 2014, we paid off that final chip of over $800 million. And that's why when you account for that, you can see this enormous increase in spending between 2014 and 2015. And that's where that gets identified. And so I did absolutely account for that.
Representative
Chairman.
Representative Carlson?
Well, we want to get the testimony, but we can debate those percentages, but I've got different percentages than what were shared, but I do want to hear the rest of the testimony, so thank you.
Thank you. Representative Liebling?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, the numbers, the percentage increase biennium over biennium was actually, according to the numbers I have, lower than had been in previous times. But we'll save that for later. What I really wanted to ask Mr. Nelson, looking at your slide under recommendations, and you're talking about starting with spending reductions in HHS, that got my attention. So I wanted to ask you, when you talk about this ranking where Minnesota ranked 4th, I'd have to check that, but I wonder if that considers the fact that Minnesota, unlike many other states, gets only a 50% federal match. And that's, I believe those federal match rates are based upon that we actually have lower cost health care here, but that's something that I think would figure into that ranking. Also, it's interesting that you're coming up to testify just following the previous testifier who was talking about how important it is to allow people with disabilities to get more independence. Because we did hear from our state economist, I think in this committee, at least on a couple of occasions, saying that one of the ways we need to deal with the falling numbers of working people compared to the elderly is that we need to invest in productivity and make sure that we have continuing to increase the productivity of each worker. In my mind, that includes people with disabilities, and it includes the fact that we right now have we're under a federal court order with regard to how we're dealing with people with disabilities in order to give them more independence and more choice. And that consumes a very large part of our HHS budget, and probably a growing part, because independence and allowing them, giving them the resources to be independent and to be more productive does cost more money up front. So I guess I'd like you to comment on all of that when you're, or maybe you don't need to comment, Mr. Chair. Maybe it's just my comment. I'll just maybe leave it there that, you know, when we talk about the HHS budget, we're not just talking about spending money and throwing it away. We're investing in people's productivity. And I would argue that when we talk about people under 200%, this figure that you've got here about ranking second on public welfare spending, well, you're not talking about our MFIP program there, because the money in that program hasn't been increased since 1986. So I think you're talking there about public health care spending and human services spending. A lot of that is for the elderly. A lot of that is for people with disabilities. And I think that's really important spending. It's investment in people's productivity, which is something that we are going to continue to need very, very badly as we move forward and have fewer workers per elderly person.
Well, I certainly hope that we're not throwing away money in any of the committees that we have, including Health and Human Services, and there are certainly very valid needs there. I guess I want to be deferential to all the people that we have that want to testify, but Mr. Nelson, do you want to respond at all to Representative Liebling?
Yeah, I'll just
briefly
respond quickly, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Representative Liebling, the Medicaid number that I gave you is a combination of state and federal funding, so it does truly reflect the fact that we spend quite a bit on Medicaid relative to other states. To your other point on the disabled population, if we are going to fund the needs of the disabled community in the next 10 years and fund those who truly need our support, we need to be very careful about how we're spending our money today. We have not paid nearly enough attention to these programs and how they're spending money and whether they are delivering the value that we should expect from our tax dollars, and whether they are actually truly creating that independence that we want. We're not evaluating our public programs nearly as much as we should, which is why, as an organization, we support outcome budgeting that would institutionalize reviews and evaluations of these programs more so than we have already, because we absolutely need to have those funds available for the disabled and the people who need our support in 10 years. And if we don't evaluate that right now and be very careful about how we set those targets and set those spending limits today, that money isn't going to be available in 10 years.
Well, Mr. Chair, just
Representative Liebing, we've got a lot of people to testify. Do you?
I know, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that on that point, I do agree with you, and I, in fact, am drafting a bill to do just that, and I hope that we will spend a lot more effort making sure that every dollar is well spent. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, seeing no further questions, Mr. Nelson, thank you for your testimony. Representative Winkler, do you want to testify given the list of people that we have? You do. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'll be very brief. You have on your agenda a rules amendment that I offered on the floor and moved from the Rules Committee where it was going to be considered after it was pulled from the floor. And I wonder what your intention with that amendment is. And there are people in this room who want to testify on behalf of senior citizens and the disabled and public schools and early childhood and colleges and universities, our local communities. All those people want to come in and talk about how important our budget is. So I don't want to get into a long debate about the budget target, but I'm wondering why a House rule amendment ends up in the Ways and Means Committee today and what your intention is with that amendment.
Well, Representative Winkler, we did have a bit of a discussion about this before. As I recall, that was the House Minority Leader of your party that made the motion to send that here to Ways and Means, and I think that it passed. It wasn't a recorded vote, but I didn't remember hearing anyone give a voice vote against it. I guess my feeling on it is that it probably should have been here rather than in the Rules Committee because we set the budget resolution. This is a proposed budget resolution number, and so it would seem to me that this is a number that, you know, if it's going to be proposed, should be considered. And I guess, Representative Winkler, since you're here, maybe I can ask you, is this the number that you support for the budget resolution?
Mr. Chair, I think it's pretty clear that the $39 billion number that I'm suggesting in this amendment illustrates a point, which is that $39 billion is the budget number that was passed in the last biennium for the current budget, and the number that has been accused of being wasteful or bloated, et cetera. And in order to achieve that, it would require a $2 billion cut from proposed spending in the next biennium, which I don't support, and I don't suppose many members of my party would support. And I think the point is that we would encourage you to continue the good work that has been done over the last couple of years to expand opportunity for all Minnesotans, to try to fund a tuition freeze, expand early childhood education, to continue our work of increasing funding for nursing homes, et cetera. And so, no, I don't support a $39 billion number, but that is the number that we've heard is wasteful and inefficient, and I think it's fair that the legislature would at some point have a vote on this other than moving it up from the floor to a Rules Committee. And that's why I'm here, is to find out what your intention is to do with this amendment.
Well, Representative Winkler, the process that we have for adopting a budget resolution, which is the same process that we've had for at least the last 8 years underneath both parties, as that the Ways and Means Committee recommends a budget resolution to the floor that they vote on, and then we don't adopt the budget resolution on the floor. We set the targets, we set the budget resolution here. That's what our current rules say. That's what the rules of the last 2 years when your party was in power said. That's what the rules the 2 years before that when the Republicans in party was in power said. That's what the rules the 4 years before that when the Democrats were in power said. So that's what we're doing. So I don't anticipate having a vote on this on the floor. But I guess just to be clear, this is your resolution, but you do not support this general fund budget target. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, the $39 billion rule amendment was to limit the budget that the House could pass out in its original or its first round of budgeting. That number represents the budget that was called wasteful and bloated and inefficient.
Representative Winkler, this is your resolution. Do you support this budget target number for total general fund spending or not?
Mr. Chair, I support having a vote on that budget resolution target number. I think the number is far too low.
Representative Winkler, did you vote for the permanent rules of the House in 2011?
Mr. Chair, I don't recall.
All right. Well, we'll be interested to see, Representative Winkler, because underneath those rules, you would not have a vote like this on the floor. So this is the place where we have those votes. It's the place where we've had the votes underneath either party for the last 8 years. Interestingly, Representative Winkler, when I was chair of Ways and Means before, we did have those votes on the floor. But for the last 8 years, we have not. And that's the process that both parties have. And so I guess I'm anticipating that we will comply with House rules. If you wish to bring a change to suspend the rules and change things from the practice of both parties over the last 8 years, you certainly have that right. But I don't anticipate that we'll be having a vote on this on the floor. But I wanted to give you the chance to testify because this is your proposed rule, Representative Winkler, and we do want to consider this number or any other number that people want to bring forward. And so I did want to give you a chance to bring this forward. But I understand from you that you actually don't support this number as the general fund budget resolution yourself. You believe it's a number that others maybe should be supporting, but you apparently don't propose it yourself.
And Mr. Chair, as I stated at the beginning, it was to illustrate a point, and I think you knew that when you put this on your agenda for your committee today.
Well, again, I want to be respectful of everyone that wants to bring a number forward, and so we put it on the agenda. But thank you, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, I've got Susie Schatz with the Minnesota Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. Oh, and I've also got a Steve Larson with the same group. I don't know if you guys want to testify together, since you're the same group. Are you the same group?
Different information.
Oh, different? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, Ms. Schatz, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Susie Schatz, and I'm from Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota, but I'm here today from the Minnesota Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. CCD is a broad-range coalition of 50 organizations that work in Minnesota to change public policy that impacts people with disabilities. We represent thousands of people with disabilities, workers, and families statewide. We're here today to encourage you to allow for targets in Representative Dean's HHS committee that will allow people with disabilities to live more independent lives, that will make work pay, and that will meet Minnesota's Olmstead Plan. Medical assistance provides people with disabilities access to services that are actually required for living independently in the community. Current law holds people with disabilities to standards and income limits that force many to spend down already very limited resources that they need for independence. If a person with disabilities makes even $1 over $973 a month, they have to spend down to $730 a month, which is quite significant on already very, very limited resources. And they're also not able to keep over $3,000, which makes home repairs and staying independent really difficult. When a person with disabilities is unable to pay this spend down, the provider that provides them service are the ones that actually absorb the cost, and eventually they often have to stop serving that client. That's a major hardship, and especially in greater Minnesota where the number of providers is far more limited. Often individuals who are subject to the spend down have actually worked, and that's why they have maybe a little bit more money. But this deep of a spend down is really a disincentive and a punishment for work. And to Representative Liebling's comments, it really is an impact on productivity when folks can't do that. We ask for your support of Representative Zerwas's bill that would raise the income and asset and spend down standards and reduce the spend down. This would have a significant impact on people with disabilities able to keep a little bit more money in their pockets, and it would also reduce the strain on providers who are currently having to absorb those unpaid spend downs. We can make a significant impact on this issue, impacting the lives of 12,000 Minnesotans and the providers who want to continue serving them across Minnesota. On a related note, Representative Albright has legislation this session that would repeal the premium increases on medical assistance for employed persons with disabilities that passed in 2011. This program allows people to be on medical assistance, people with disabilities, and allows them to continue working and paying a premium to do so. In 2011, and actually it just went into effect this past October, the monthly charge for that almost doubled, and the the percentage on unearned income was raised from 0.5% to 5%. It's yet another disincentive to work for people with disabilities, and people want to work. This would impact 8,700 Minnesotans, and some are going to have to make the choice of whether that increase in that significant of an increase in premium is going to continue to make work pay for them. That has a cost of about $5.5 million to repeal that premium. Many of you around this table hosted signs at your office this last week that told stories of people with disabilities who are impacted by MAPD premium increases, by the spend down and asset limits. We thank you so much for helping us to share that story of that impact, and we hope that you'll continue to support targets that would allow for those bills. Finally, Representative Hamilton's proposal for the 5% campaign is really necessary to reducing turnover of home and community-based services staff, and especially in greater Minnesota. The Minnesota economy has improved, which actually makes it more difficult to keep the shifts filled in many of those homes in greater Minnesota when workers can go to the local fast food restaurant and make more money. The increases from the 5% we know will go back directly into Minnesota's economy. They'll help to reduce turnover in those services, improving the lives of individuals, the workers, families, and everybody in Minnesota. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Schatz. Next, I have Erica Schmiel, the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance. Ms. Schmiel, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Thank you very much. My name is Erica Schmiel, and I'm with the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance. The Alliance is dedicated to serving the 100,000 Minnesotans who live with a disability due to brain injury, their loved ones, and the professionals who work with them. I want to thank you for the opportunity to comment on the House Budget Resolution and specifically the Health and Human Services spending target. The Brain Injury Alliance, like many other disability-based organizations, including the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, has prioritized medical assistance, or MA reform, in 2015. The problem with current policy is that the qualifying standards for people with disabilities are too low, and MA work incentive premiums have risen dramatically. MA reform is essential to accomplish a number of objectives important to this committee, and I'd like to comment on just a few. MA reform supports independence. It allows people with disabilities to be more successful at living independently in their community. It removes disincentives to work and allows more savings and income to reduce dependence on the state. MA reform increases stability in people's lives and the delivery of services. People who can't afford paying for services either go without care, or providers of MA services are expected to pick up these costs. MA reform increases cost effectiveness. Providing home and community-based supports saves the state resources by keeping people out of much more costly institutional and emergency-based care. MA reform fixes a major hole in the safety net and corrects a state policy that drives adults with disabilities deep into poverty just to get the supports and services they need to live independently. Making progress on MA reform depends on getting an adequate spending target for health and human services. Someone like Denise Johnson, who suffered a stroke at the age of 50, is expected to pay a $775 spend down each and every month on her own health care and the services she needs to stay in her town home in Farmington before MA starts paying. She is quickly losing everything she has and could become completely dependent on the state for her care. 10 members of Denise's family visited the Capitol just last week, compelled to let their legislators know how completely backward current MA policy is. Not everyone is lucky enough to have 10 family members advocate for them. 11,500 Minnesotans are faced with the spend down issue each month. It's been 32 years since the MA asset limit for people with disabilities was last raised, and 13 years since the spend down standard was last raised. MA reform is long overdue, and we are counting on you to give the Health and Human Services target a high enough target to move forward on MA reform this session. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Ms. Schmiel, thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome.
Next, I have Kurt Rutzen with ARC Minnesota.
Mr. Chair, I'm Steve Larson with the ARC Minnesota and the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. We're going to put our 5 minutes together, and Mr. Rutson will begin.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Mr. Rutson.
Hello, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Kurt Rutson with the ARC of Minnesota. On behalf of persons with disabilities, we urge you to include enough funding in the HHS budget target to meet the important needs which require attention now after over a decade of budget deficits which resulted in repeated cuts in disability services. I want to tell you about my family who's made sacrifices for me early on. I went through speech therapy and on and on. I forget my thought process, but I'm so thankful that they did that. And if we get it early on, we can save money and we can kick it down the road and somebody pay for it later, you guys. But the fact of the matter is, and in all respect, you guys, I don't want to sound moment here, but a lot of those people may not be here by that time, way down the road. So let's find out a way to pay it now and take care of these people. I don't use a lot of services. I use some, but that was because my mom and dad, at an early age, sacrificed and all kinds of stuff, and I'm so blessed. And I know you guys know this stuff, and I thank you for your time and for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rutson.
Mr. Chair and committee members, I'm glad you were able to hear Kurt's story, and I just want to emphasize that he used intensive services as a child and throughout his early adult life, but now lives quite independently and is a volunteer lobbyist with the ARC Minnesota. So investment in individuals such as Kurt and other persons with disabilities can pay off, and we look forward to looking at any bills that look at outcomes and the cost benefit of some of these services. I'm here mainly to talk about home and community-based services and the waiver programs. The projected growth needed for both the developmental disabilities waiver and the CADI, CAC, and TBI waivers was cut in every year beginning in 2002 except for 1 year in 2008. And those cuts were the result of trying to meet the needs of a budget deficit. So that means insufficient funding for the last 11 or 12 years. Those services are needed now because we have a waiting list of 5,000 people for our waiver programs. And as was mentioned by one of the earlier testifiers, we have substantial Olmstead goals that we need to make with federal court oversight to meet the housing and employment goals of persons with disabilities to receive their services in the most integrated setting. And we think we could be doing a much better job with the money that's invested in persons with disabilities to achieve those particular goals. Cuts to needed growth in waiver programs will mean less employment, more isolation, leaving people with disabilities in need of more and longer-term services when their parents become unable to care for them or they have a crisis from not getting appropriate services over many years. And recently, one of our advocates found on the MMB website a fiscal note to cut the waiver growth again, or at least a fiscal note was developed on that. And so we're very concerned that that would receive serious attention by this legislative session. In addition to that, we are looking forward once again to supporting the 5% bill by Representative Hamilton, along with the funding for the State Quality Council, which Representative Hamilton has also authored, because we think that that would lead to higher quality and greater outcomes for persons with disabilities. We're also working on expanding self-directed options through a bill that Representative Mack has to expand self-directed employment services. And in addition to that, we're looking at having more families receive the needed services they have because they cannot afford parental fees by lowering or eliminating those parental fees during this legislative session. Forecasted growth for these critically important services should not be cut in the Health and Human Services budget target. Given the waiting list and the serious consequences for individuals in our state if critical services which support persons with disabilities to increase their independence are not funded. We want to thank the state for its support of persons with disabilities, and we look forward to working with you throughout this legislative session on these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Next on the list is Jill Larson with the Minnesota Business Partnership. Ms. Larson, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, I didn't think you were going to call me right away. I would have been ready to go. Yes, Mr. Chairman, members, I am Jill Larson with the Minnesota Business Partnership. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning about our principles with respect to setting the overall budget targets. We appreciate the discussion and understand that you all have a very, very difficult job to do. Very many competing interests, and we appreciate all of your work. In general, as was discussed earlier, the Budget Trends Study Commission did some really important work. And one of the things that it recommended was that when we look at long-term spending, we try to align that with long-term economic growth. At the time that study was done, I think revenues were projected to grow about 3% a year, and spending was projected to go about 4.5% or 5% a year. And as you can do the math, those don't add up. And so what we would recommend is that as you're setting the overall target, you look at what the long-term revenue growth or economic growth looks like and compare it to the long-term spending trends. And we're really concerned about the tails of any of these permanent spending programs. And we already have some of the highest tax rates in the country in lots of areas. Individual income tax, corporate income tax, business property tax. And our concern is that if a lot of permanent spending is put into place, when we do hit another economic downturn, which we most likely will, if we go into a deficit situation, we're really concerned about the potential for additional tax increases. That's why we do recommend some additional funding for the reserve. We don't have a specific amount that we think is the exact right amount. I think it is a balancing act. There's the caution that if we maybe put too much in the reserve, that it makes it less difficult to make some decisions about what is the best outcome on spending. So, but we do want to cushion against some of the revenue volatility. As was discussed earlier, the personal income tax and the corporate income tax are two of the most volatile revenue sources we have. In 2013, the legislature increased substantially both the personal income tax and the corporate income tax. So the 2013 tax bill exacerbated an already very volatile revenue system. And so we are concerned again that if and when the economy turns south, that we're going to see some real swings in our revenues. And so we would support adding some money to the tax budget target to provide some business tax relief that would help make Minnesota more competitive with respect to the business tax climate. And it would also reduce the revenue volatility if you reduced the corporate tax, whether through a rate reduction or increasing the R&D tax credit, which we support, decreasing the personal income tax, and we also support using some of the tax target to reduce the statewide business property tax. We don't recommend that you spend it all. Like I mentioned earlier, we're concerned about the spending tails, but we do support investing some of the surplus in tax reduction, transportation, and you can use some of the revenue, some of the surplus for some one-time expenditures. You can include transportation in that as well. So appreciate the opportunity to share some principles and be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Representative Wagenius.
Well, thank you. If my recollection is correct, at one time you supported early childhood. I did not hear you mention that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wagenius, yes, you are right. I'm trying to limit my comments, but we do support more funding for early childhood education. I think we would recommend a more targeted approach, perhaps through the parent-aware scholarships or through some targeted tax credits. We think that is a better way to really target trying to narrow the achievement gap.
All right, thank you for your testimony, Ms. Larson. Next, I have Grace Kelleher with the Minnesota School Boards Association and Gary Amoroso with the Minnesota Association of School Administrators. I guess I was under the understanding that you both wanted to testify together. As I mentioned, I have to go to a commitment at noon. I will listen to the rest of the testimony, and I will turn the chair over to Vice Chair Albright.
Welcome to the committee. If you could announce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Grace Kelleher, and I represent the Minnesota School Boards Association. We represent every school district in the state of Minnesota. I'm glad to be here today. I feel like we're sort of door knocking for dollars here for education, so I hope you enjoy our remarks. Our request this year is for $875 million. Seems like a whopper number, but it's not. Our Constitution is very clear. Your duty is to provide two things for the state: transportation and education. My favorite part is Minnesota Constitution, Article 13, Section 1. It is the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. The legislature shall make such provision by taxation or otherwise as will secure a thorough and efficient system of public schools. Presently, funding for K-12 comes out of the basic education formula. That is presently at $5,831. This is what school districts use to pay for teacher salaries and benefits, buses, and costs associated with buses like drivers and operators, paraprofessional salaries and benefits, learning materials, teacher training, unfunded special education, and our accountability systems, educational supplies, and student programs. The last budget cycle, the legislature increased expectations for our school districts, and here are just a few to share with you that we're working to do. Ensuring every child is college and career ready. Statewide teacher evaluation system. Preparing students for all-day K. Statewide health insurance transparency act. Additional human resource requirements. New test requirements for technology, pensions increase, closing the achievement gap. And any increase in this formula comes from just you. There is no inflationary amounts in this. But let me get to the facts, because everybody says, just give me the numbers. Here it is. We have 332 school districts. We have 854,000 enrolled students. We have 78,000 students in concurrent enrollment in PSEO. We have about 387,000 students in secondary and 382 in elementary. We have 54,000 full-time teachers, and their average salary is $54,752. We are very concerned that 5 years out from now, it will be extremely difficult to find teachers. We're starting to see it in the urban areas as well as in outstate. And when Minneapolis and Thief River Falls agree on a point, that's a loud message to you that teachers are in short supply. Over 90% of our school districts have operating referendums to continue to fund K-12. And of course, our early childhood programs, which you hear so much about. ECFE gets about $27 million in state aid and $22 million in tax. 329 out of our 332 districts receive it. School Readiness gets $12 million in state aid and serves every school district in the state. Head Start receives $97 million from federal aid and $20 million from state aid and has 35 grantees serving about 1,600 students. School sizes range all over the book, some as big as 39,000 and some as small as 43. Adjusted net tax capacity, or how we raise these operating referendums, varies greatly per pupil from 39,000 to 2,000. So it's a challenging environment out there. But I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Amoroso, who's going to talk about what we see in the future.
Welcome, Mr. Amoroso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Gary Amoroso. I serve as the Executive Director of the Minnesota Association of School Administrators. That is the organization that works on behalf of the superintendents of the state of Minnesota and other district-level employees, such as directors of teaching and learning, special education directors, assistant superintendents, technology directors. And we acknowledge the very challenging task that you have. We have a great state in Minnesota, and we have a lot of needs. But I ask you to consider the fact that Ms. Kelleher and myself, as we sit here and we talk about MSBA, MESA, what we're really talking about are the 854,000 students that live in the state. That's who we're advocating for. Every single child that attends public schools in the state of Minnesota is who we're advocating for. We've had a few things occur over the past, decade that have caused us to have challenges with financing. All of you know that have served since that time. We had the recession, we had the housing market. And what we've seen is that over the last 12 years, because of the challenges that the nation faced, that the state faced, the basic general education formula, and that is the formula that truly drives the funding that the state provides to school districts. That formula is, as we sit today, about $1,200 lower than it would be based on the implicit price deflator. And we understand that that was a challenge that we all faced, but it's a fact that we think needs to be taken into account as we look at a target for the next biennium. We have a special education cross-subsidy of over $200 million from the state side of the equation. If you add in the entire cross-subsidy because of the federal issues with revenue, our school districts have a $600 million cross-subsidy that they're paying. And in order to fill that cross-subsidy, we take general education dollars and provide the service to our special education children. We are not in any way, shape, manner, or form saying that we don't want to have those services and need those services for our special ed children, but we believe that our regular education children suffer because we don't have enough of the funding coming their way. We have a statewide task force that's been looking at the state of facilities within our state. We have approximately $142 million worth of issues that could be addressed across the state in the area of facilities. We've added the all-day K program, as Ms. Kelleher said. There's conversations now about adding a 4-year-old program. The facilities issue is getting to a boiling point, and it is going to cause us a lot of concern. We have a teacher development and evaluation model that was approved by the state, signed into law by the governor, and it's estimated that the true implementation of that plan would be about $140 million per year. We were grateful that we received $10 million from the legislature this year to begin that implementation, but we believe that that we need the additional funding to truly implement the plan in a way that achieves the goals that it was set out to achieve. And we talked about technology in many different formats. We have online assessments that are going to be required this year across the board, I believe. That is going to cause districts challenges, as well as we have the have-nots and the haves in the area of technology and infrastructure and availability to students. That's an area that we think needs to be looked at. Again, when you hear a number that Ms. Keller said, $875 million, we probably could have looked at all of these types of scenarios that we're talking about and have had a larger number. We understand that you have challenges. But I'm going to ask you once again, as you're having your conversations over the next weeks, please consider that we're talking about 854,000 public school children. I'm a former U.S. history teacher, and I can sincerely say from the bottom of my heart that I truly believe that the most significant attribute of a democracy is an educated populace. As a legislature, it is your responsibility as defined in our Constitution to provide that education and to provide those resources. With that, Mr. Chair and Committee, I thank you for providing us with this opportunity to share our thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Amoroso. Representative Murphy, you had a question?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I would just like Ms. Kelleher to repeat that first number of what they're asking for.
Ms. Kelleher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Murphy, the number is $875 million. Correct. Not pennies.
Thank you both for your testimony.
Thank you.
We have Sue Abderholden next on the list. And then after Ms. Abderholden, we have Daryl Dannon. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Abderholden.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. For the record, my name is Sue Abderholden, Executive Director of NAMI, Minnesota. NAMI is a statewide grassroots advocacy organization dedicated to improving the lives of children and adults with mental illnesses and their families. We are the people we represent with nearly 100% of our board and staff either living with a mental illness or having a family member. Mental illnesses affect 20 to 25% of the population. It's an extremely common illness, and yet many children and adults with mental illnesses and their families cannot access the treatment, services, and supports that are needed to get better. Access is limited due to lack of funding by both public and private health insurance, low reimbursement rates, limited grant funding, and a workforce shortage. I do want to just say that we rely heavily on Medicaid and state grants for the mental health system due to, frankly, the discrimination that people with mental illnesses face in the private insurance market. And there's little appetite for adding new mandates. Over and over again, we hear complaints from individuals, families, emergency department staff, police, sheriffs, teachers, and others about the difficulty accessing care and the poor outcomes that follow. Children with mental illnesses drop out of high school at a high rate. A large percentage of people who are homeless live with a mental illness, and too many children and adults with mental illnesses end up in our juvenile justice or criminal justice system. Close to 700 people die every year in Minnesota by suicide. We've spent the last 7 to 10 years building the foundation of our mental health system, creating effective home and community-based services and supports, mobile and residential crisis services, and intensive residential services. We do know what works. And we need to complete what we started and finish building our mental health system. But we can't do that if the target for Health and Human Services is lower than what's in the governor's budget. During the recessions, the mental health system was cut by both parties. And when we weren't in a recession, the mental health system has received support, again, for both parties. We, the mental health community, have worked hard to develop proposals that will really take our system to the next level. There have been over 30 bills introduced in the House and the Senate, authored and co-authored by members of both parties. And these bills will do a lot of things, including improving access to effective services, expanding our mental health workforce, providing support to families of children with mental illnesses, providing housing and employment supports, expanding access to home and community-based supports, and expanding access to crisis services, earlier intervention, and intensive services, and increasing our efforts to prevent suicide. Frankly, we came into this session with hope in our hearts that now that the economy is doing better, our state would do better for children and adults who live with a mental illness and their families. Please don't cut funding for this area of the budget. Human Services really has an impact, a profound impact on people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Abderholden. Next we have Danielle Dannon. And then after Ms. Dannon, we have the Mary Krinke from Minnesota Hospital Association. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Dannon.
Thank you for having me. So for the record, my name is Darielle Dannon, and I currently co-chair Homes for All, which is a statewide organization of over 150 organizations, ranging from law enforcement to housing developers to a number of cities and school districts. These organizations came together and developed an agenda of strategic investments of $39 million in housing and services that are needed to support the continuum of unmet housing needs across the state. Our agenda supports additional investments of $19.5 million in programs at the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency and $19.5 million for programs at the Department of Human Services. Housing has gotten increasing media attention over the past few years, and I think there were 2 articles in the Star Tribune about it this last weekend. There was an article about the Star Tribune just last week about the almost 36,000 people who applied for the Section 8 voucher waiting list. There have also been recent articles about the lack of sufficient housing for workers in areas that are growing jobs, including regional centers such as northwestern Minnesota, St. Cloud, Rochester, Worthington, and Wilmer. Cities have identified that their growing workforce, especially entry-level and service sector workers, will need more housing options in both rental and home ownership. Minnesota Housing has estimated that the state would need to build between 45,000 and 75,000 units of housing to address needs in areas of the state where we have low vacancy rates and low and moderate wage workers are struggling to find adequate housing. We don't have enough housing to meet the needs of low-income Minnesotans or many moderate-income Minnesotans, and as a result, 1 in 8 Minnesotans pay more than half of their income towards housing. As a state, we have a continuum of programs that are intended to support both very low-income families who are struggling with homelessness, as well as programs supporting entry-level and service sector workers. We know that for every dollar invested in supportive housing programs, the state sees a return of $1.44. We also know that for every dollar in state funding for gap financing, so to construct some of that housing, it leverages at least $3 in private funding. Our ask supports the continuum of housing options with funding for programs that act as a safety net and help keep people in their homes, funding for the development of housing ranging from housing for very low income to moderate income households in both rental and home ownership. And finally, funding for a program that helps homeowners with health and safety renovations, primarily serving seniors in greater Minnesota. The primary development program our ask supports also supports Minnesotans who are making up to $58,000 a year for rental housing and $82,000 a year for home ownership. So it really ranges the gamut. That easily supports home housing for someone making the average starting wage at somewhere like Polaris, which is $14 an hour. And that's about $30,000 a year. And these programs also support Minnesotan families as they move up the income ladder into home ownership, reaching up to $82,000 a year, and that's just under $40 an hour. So often if there's two people working in a family, that'll support those folks. These programs also are working to close the racial home ownership gap, help with down payment assistance, and support seniors. In other states like Utah and Florida, they've realized that it saves the state significantly to invest in homeless individuals. In Florida, they recently released a report that found that chronically homeless persons cost the state $31,000 per year. That same person, if the state invests in the housing and services they need, costs the state about $10,000 per year. So obviously, saves the state millions of dollars to put money up front into supporting people. In 2013, the legislature chose to provide additional investments in the Challenge Fund, and that's the state's primary vehicle for housing development. And we created the Job Growth and Housing Initiative. It was a $10 million program intended to address the housing needs of the low and moderate wage workforce. Through those increased investments, as well as last year's $10 million bonding investment, we are in the process right now of building 4,560 additional units of housing across the state. And this year, our agenda includes further investments in both that initiative and some others. So the Homes for All legislative agenda, it provides strategic investments to proven programs that will save taxpayer dollars and support the local workforce. If fully funded, these increased investments will support almost 10,000 additional Minnesotan households. I'm asking you for your support in the DHS and Job Growth and Energy, Affordability, Policy, and Finance Committee's budgets to provide spending targets that can include these modest increase in investments of $19.5 million to the MHFA budget and $19.5 million to the DHS budget.
Thank you, Ms. Day.
Thank you.
Next we have Ms. Krinke from the Minnesota Hospital Association, and then Beth Stridden-Kadoon from the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee members who stuck around for this long hearing today. Thank you very much. The good news is that Americans are living longer. The average life expectancy now in our country is 81 years of age. The bad news is that fewer of us are considered to be disease-free. What the translation is that more of us are going to be needing health care services, and of course this has a financial price. In 2013, Minnesota's 143 hospitals, and 79 of them are critical access hospitals scattered throughout the rural parts of our state, employed 121,000 individuals. In 2010, the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development did a study of the hospital sector of our economy, and they found that for every 10 jobs created in a hospital, another 9 jobs were created out in the community, one of the best economic multipliers of any other industry. We don't talk about this very much because hospitals don't share this information, but in 2013 we had 40 hospitals in Minnesota that had negative operating margins. The Health and Human Service budget is projected to grow considerably. We've taken a look at the budget, and I just want to point out 2 of the fastest areas of growth. The first one is the elderly and disabled basic care. This is taking care of our elderly populations and disabled populations. That sector is expected to grow by $456 million for this biennium to the next. The second area is the long-term care waivers, which is expected to grow by $409 million. Now, it is important to note that the long-term care waivers probably save our healthcare system money because it is probably cheaper than the nursing homes. So it's just important to note that while the waivers are growing fast, it is probably saving money on the long-term care of the nursing homes. Legislators have many difficult budget choices to make this legislative session. We believe that there is broad bipartisan support to support many of the new initiatives, more funding for nursing homes, more funding for mental health. What we are asking the House to do is to set the budget target high enough to cover the new initiatives that members want to spend money on. It is going to be very difficult to find those resources within the existing Health and Human Services budget. So the Hospital Association would like to ask members of this committee and the legislature, if there are areas that you do want to spend new money on, bring in new money to the Health and Human Services budget. Don't think that you can easily get that money from existing resources within the Health and Human Services budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Crickey. Next we have Beth Cadoon from the Minnesota Chamber, and then finally Benjamin Ashley Workman from the Mental Health Association of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Beth Gadoon. I represent the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, an organization of 2,300 businesses across the state of Minnesota. As you undergo this very important and difficult task of setting the budget targets, we would urge you to prioritize the targets that will best position Minnesota for a strong, vibrant, and growing economy, and addressing areas that impede economic growth and where Minnesota is uncompetitive. A key part of Minnesota's economic success is a strong business climate. There are 2 major components to a strong business climate. One is foundational competitiveness. That is your state's infrastructure, the workforce, etc. A second component is the investment attractiveness, and that is the cost side of the equation. Minnesota ranks high on foundational competitiveness. We rank very high on our workforce, quality of life, many of those indicators that make us such a great place to live and work. Unfortunately, Minnesota does not rank high on the cost side of the equation. And that is where we urge you to focus your efforts to make us more competitive in this area. According to a Harvard competitiveness researcher, states with lower cost factors relative to their levels of foundational competitiveness will be more attractive and experience more rapid growth. So basically, Minnesota needs to find a way to provide these high-quality services at a competitive price. Unfortunately, Minnesota's business cost climate became much more uncompetitive in the 2013 session. Taxes were increased by nearly $2 billion, with a great portion of those falling on the business community. This has resulted in Minnesota's business tax rankings increasing to some of the worst in the nation, for example, 49th worst for the small business index. Our top rates, as mentioned, 4th highest on the individual income tax, 3rd highest on the corporate rate, 5th highest in many business property taxes. We're only one of 14 states to still have an estate tax. So we strongly urge you to focus your budget targets on lowering the tax burden on Minnesota businesses in order to improve our competitiveness. We believe this should be one of the top priorities. Secondly, we recommend focusing some of the general fund dollars on key infrastructure needs of transportation, workforce development, and workforce housing. A strong transportation system is a key infrastructure need, and we believe it should be given some priority in your general fund budget debate. 33 other states do provide some general fund funding for the roads and bridges. We think Minnesota needs to do the same. For other spending, we recommend first focusing on making sure our current programs are effective and efficient as possible, and reprioritizing if you need additional spending prior to increasing pressure on taxpayers. As I mentioned, we do support some additional dollars, I believe, for some workforce housing. It's really being seen as a great need in greater Minnesota. Some of those can be one-time dollars, and some other changes maybe for TIF as well. And then we do support some current proposals for workforce training, dual credit, college credit in the high schools, and Representative O'Neill's Earn and Learn bill. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for your testimony. We have one late addition, so in addition to Mr. Wertman, we have Joan Wilshire from the Minnesota State Council on Disability. Is Mr. Wertman not here? All right, then we'll proceed to Ms. Wilshire. Is he?
I'll be real quick. Joan Wilshire, Executive Director of the State Council on Disability. Thanks
Welcome
for
to the
squeaking me
committee.
in here.
You bet.
MISCAT is one of the state advisory agencies to Minnesota government. Well, we support investing in health and human services and hope your budget targets will reflect that. We just want to remind you that 20% of the population are actually people with disabilities, and that includes children to seniors, that 20% figure. People with disabilities want to be a part of society and should be part of the community. As the state looks to move the Olmstead Plan forward, we will need health and human services funds to start moving that dial forward. If we do not fund human services adequately, people will be at risk of institutionalization. So on behalf of the State Council on Disability, we hope you will consider good, adequate targets for health and human services. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any other testifiers that would like to? Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record, please. Who you represent.
Good afternoon. I'm Paul Gavel. I'm here on behalf of the American Federation of State and County Municipal Employees, AFSCME. I'm here today to ask that you take and use the surplus money to make investments in public safety, including the food service bills and safe staffing levels for corrections. I am a corrections officer, and that's very important for me and my job and safety of my coworkers. Investments in health and human services, including the Minnesota security hospitals and long-term care programs. Transportation funding across the state is something that we're in dire need of, and certainly, last but not least, education funding. We shouldn't give the money back to taxpayers because they've entrusted it with us already. I think that it needs to be used to invest in the future of Minnesota and to do it wisely. And investing in those areas, you'll get good results.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Representative Carlson.
Are we done?
Yes, we are.
Now, I don't know if you'll have the answer to the question. I tried to respect the time of the testifiers, so while the chair was here, I did have a question on when we would be taking up the House budget resolution, and I don't know if Mr. Stone knows that. Next Monday is our regular scheduled meeting. That's within the 25 days. Is there anything that you can enlighten us on in that regard?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Carlson, we will have our regularly scheduled meeting Monday, but I'm not sure of the agenda at this point in time. I think with the governor's supplemental budget coming out, that will be probably one of the topics. I'm also looking for rooms for Tuesday evening. So
I think that's a pretty good hint then.
Well, it could be either, sir.
Representative Linchesky.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I also have a question for Representative Knobloch, but he's not here, so maybe Mr. Stone or maybe you know the answer. I noticed Representative Winkler's amendment was sent here, but not formally calendared, so I assume the committee has possession, but we actually didn't have it on the agenda as something we could vote on. When is it planned that we are actually going to have that before the committee for formal action?
I believe that I'll defer that question to Chair Knobloch, and if you want me to ask him that, I'll convey that and have him follow up with you.
Thank you very much.
Representative Carl.
Mr. Chairman, I did have a follow-up, and maybe this will be either Mr. Marks or probably Mr. Marks. What's the last day that we can adopt the budget resolution? It's 25 days from the Friday it was released.
Representative Marks. Mr. Marks.
Mr. Chair, Representative Carlson, the House rule says within 25 days. I believe 25 days is next Tuesday, or the end of the 25 days would be the end of next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow.
And, Mr. Chairman, we are meeting then Tuesday evening, probably. Okay.
I believe that it is tentatively scheduled.
Pretty good indication that it may actually, it's up to, so I suppose we could, in theory, we could meet earlier, but it sounds like you do want to hear about the governor's supplemental first. So the reason I'm pursuing that a bit is that on the posting of that, if we want to prepare amendments and so on, we need to have some advanced notice, at least of the date.
Yes.
There are two questions. One, the date that it'll be coming up. I mean, it's the resolution in and of itself. We've had in our packets the rough draft, and it would be a matter of putting the numbers in, but it would be helpful if we did know as soon as possible what the date would be then. And so if you could convey that, probably Mr. Stone.
I'm sure we'll appropriate
to
that
the chair that we would like to have at least the date. That would be helpful.
Representative Linczewski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, on that, and again, sorry that Chair Knobloch isn't here, but anticipating, that's usually a day with a lot of work in the committee and takes time. Is that, I can't remember, does Chair Knobloch have a 24-hour rule? He does.
He does.
Okay. And so I think that's really important.
Linczewski, there is a possibility that rule may be waived in anticipation of Tuesday.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, additionally, I had a question. So, I was looking for my yellow booklet in here, and I don't have it. So committee rules are midnight this year, is that correct? Okay, so, obviously it's up to you guys to manage the time, but if we're not coming in until Tuesday night, it seems, and I assume there'll be public testimony as well.
With that, members, we are adjourned.